Athens, August 9, 1978. Olympic Airways Flight 411 is preparing for takeoff from Athens' Ellinikon International Airport. While it accelerates down the runway, one of its engines explodes in the searing heat of summer. As the aircraft has already reached rotational speed, there's no turning back, and it has to get into the air now. This plane is now struggling to climb quickly enough without one of its engines, as the threat to stall is almost inevitable. The lives of 418 people on board now depend on what the pilots do in the next few minutes. Were they able to avoid a terrible tragedy in Athens? Let's find out. This is a story of Olympic Airways Flight 411. It's a hot Greek summer afternoon in Athens' Ellinikon International Airport, the main airport in Athens at the time. 400 passengers and 18 crew members were preparing for their long journey to New York, waiting to board the massive Boeing 747, so-called Queen of the Skies, belonging to Greece's flag carrier, Olympic Airways. Most of the passengers were Americans heading back to the U.S. after vacationing in Greece. The flight was scheduled as Flight 411 and was set to depart at 2 p.m. from Athens' Ellinikon International Airport to JFK International Airport in New York. The plane for today's flight was the Boeing 747-200 quadjet, which was common in many airlines' fleets at the time and had been first delivered to Olympic Airways in 1973. This plane was equipped with a Pratt & Whitney JT9D turbofan engines. The engines were reportedly developed on an accelerated timetable and resulted in some engine flaws, thereby needing proper maintenance to run efficiently. Olympic Airways acquired a lot of 747s for its prime route, including a non-stop route between Athens and New York. Now, something that you need to understand about Athens is that sometimes the locals refer to it as Lekanopidio, which roughly translates to English as a wash basin. The reason being that it's surrounded on three sides by fairly high terrain. So the only real escape route, if you want to avoid the terrain, is out over the sea, which is located on the southwest to west side. Keep this in mind, as it's going to be really important in this story. The commander for this flight was 55-year-old Sifis Migadis, an ex-military pilot who had 32 years of experience with Olympic Airways. With him in the cockpit was the co-pilot, Konstantinos Kostas Fikardos, who was equally experienced and was a close friend of Migadis. Together with them was also a flight engineer by the name of Tribos. The pre-flight briefing and checks were conducted by the crew, and the Boeing 747 was passed fit and given clearance for takeoff. The aircraft was pushed back from the gate a little before 2 p.m. so that it could be prepared for departure. At 32 degrees Celsius, the weather was very hot but clear. Just after 2 p.m., the Boeing 747 began to taxi down runway 33R. The pilots noticed that the plane was a little slow, but continued because it's nothing unusual. The aircraft started to accelerate down the runway. It passed its V1 speed, which is the decision speed. It reached its rotation speed, and Captain Migadis started rotating when a catastrophic failure happened to the number 3 engine. The failure was so violent that the engine actually started disintegrating, and part of it fell down onto the runway and some of the houses in the departure direction. Now remember that the Boeing 747-200 is equipped with 4 Pratt & Whitney JT9D 7A engines. Those engines, under normal circumstances, can produce 46,150 pounds of thrust, which is a lot. But on that day, there had been some maintenance on one of the engines, and because of that, the engine was supposed to be operated on reduced thrust of only 96%. Now remember, this was a fully loaded flight. It had almost 140 tons of fuel on board. So it was very, very heavy, and the outside temperature was really high. At the point of this incident, however, the plane had exceeded its rotation speed, so it had to push forward with an exploded engine to continue its climb. In the cabin crew member Lucia Siachu got an intercom message from a colleague at the back. Engine number 3, or the inboard engine on the right side, had blown up, the colleague said. We're all screwed. She replied with, I know. Tower controllers watched in horror as Flight 411 struggled to climb and its broken engine scattered parts across the ground. A few complications surfaced when the captain in the cockpit did his utmost to force a performance out of the aircraft. Because engine number 2 needed some repair, it wasn't operating at its best, which made things worse for the crew. Also, just after liftoff, the water flow warning sounded in the flight deck. Unfortunately, the flight crew misinterpreted the water flow warning as a water runout warning, so they just decided to put off the water pump switch. Doing this with a damaged engine impacted the aircraft's ability to climb. However, the plane was somehow still able to take off eventually. But as the aircraft slowly took off, the flight crew found it difficult to gain both the required airspeed and altitude. However, despite needing more speed, Captain Megadis decided to immediately command a retraction of the landing gear at just 35 feet of altitude. This command was against Boeing's policies for the situation, because retracting the gear at that point would mean that the landing gear doors would open and then close, resulting in a temporary increase in drag. And at that point, any increase in drag would be enough to send the plane crashing back down. However, the first officer complied with the captain. This was because they had a hill in their flight path, which would have been impossible to clear with the landing gear slowing the plane down. The captain was relying on his decades of experience. The plane gained some altitude after the landing gear was raised, but the 200-foot hill, which was only a mile away, blocked the aircraft's path. The captain was forced to raise the aircraft's nose since he had no other option. Even after he lost all of the airspeed he had gained at this point, the 747 managed to clear the slope by only 9 feet. That threat, though, was far from over. The 747's valuable airspeed, which was required to maintain the aircraft in the air, was lost when it ascended past the hill. The jumbo jet was on the verge of crashing out of the sky, so the captain had to lower the nose of the aircraft to accelerate. In the end, the captain chose to exchange roughly 50 feet of altitude for about 6 knots of airspeed, which was just able to prevent the aircraft from stalling. At this point, the aircraft was now flying only around 200 feet above Kala, a densely populated area of Athens. The area of Kala is the second most densely populated municipality in Greece, with over 100,000 inhabitants. Thus, an air crash in such a location would have caused devastating destruction and thousands of lives to be lost. The aircraft passed close to the Athens Tower complex, which is the tallest building in Greece. It was flying so low that it barely cleared the television antennas of some of the taller buildings in the area. In fact, they were so low that some of the flight attendants were able to observe shocked expressions of people in nearby buildings as the jumbo jet flew by. The crew, who were barely managing to keep the aircraft airborne, now had to fly at a level altitude below 200 feet at a speed of 160 knots, while still being unable to turn. At that point, the captain's focus was on getting the plane away from the city and into an unpopulated area to at least reduce the potential loss of lives if the plane crashed. A translator recording from the captain revealed that he considered that it was over for everyone on board. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the passengers were unaware of what was going on, and some of them reportedly thought that they were on a planned sightseeing tour and started taking pictures. Regardless of what they thought, the aircraft was now headed for a collision with Mount Agalio, a few hundred feet ahead. With the situation as it was, the crew knew that they couldn't overfly the mountain. But their luck changed when the flight engineer was able to successfully optimize the 3 remaining engines, which gave them some more power to work with. At the same time, a southwest sea breeze began to blow, bringing up the speed of the plane, with the increasingly cooler air giving the plane a lift. The airspeed and altitude of the aircraft slowly began to creep up, but the ground beneath them was also rising. The captain knew that there was no way he could clear the mountain at the current airspeed, but he did have just enough to complete a bank turn without stalling. So he turned the plane out to sea and waited as the airspeed slowly picked up. When the aircraft hit 300 feet of altitude, the captain, now feeling more confident, decided to retract the flaps a bit. The aircraft was then able to climb to just over 1,500 feet, where it began dumping fuel to bring down its weight. With the plane much lighter, it was able to climb safely and could make its way back to Ellinikon International Airport. Against all odds, Flight 411 was able to land back at the airport without a single injury throughout the incident. Communication with air traffic control was limited, and those at the control tower were relieved to see the aircraft making it back in one piece. Though Captain Migadis didn't realize it at the time, he had just prevented the 3rd worst aviation accident in history, saving the lives of 418 people. The crowd on the ground erupted in cheers when the airplane returned. When Captain Megadis stepped off the aircraft, his 2 proud and frightened daughters were waiting for him. The Greek National Air Safety Board that investigates aviation accidents and incidents wasn't established until 2004. However, the then Vice President of Customer Support at Boeing, Brian Wiggle, did issue a report. In this report, he concluded that no malfunction in the airframe or engines caused the lack of performance following takeoff. Instead, they blamed the problem on the inadvertent shutoff of the water injection pumps by the flight crew, as well as the resulting decrease in thrust. He added that the loss of wet thrust in a situation where the aircraft was takeoff climb limited severely reduced the ability to continue the flight with any significant amount of positive climb gradient. Apparently, once thrust was manually increased at a coordination time of approximately 325 seconds, the aircraft climbed out in a normal manner. Contrary to what the captain said, the report didn't mention the explosion of engine number 3, as well as the power loss of other engines. Newspapers, on the other hand, reported that engine 3 exploded during takeoff due to the overheating of the turbine cooling pipes. When investigators looked at the data from the recorders, they were quite shocked as to how Captain Megadis had managed to keep the plane in the air despite slowing down to 158 knots at one point. In fact, all Boeing simulations of the flight resulted in crashes following the incident. Olympic Airlines changed some of its procedures based on lessons learned from the flight. Although turning off the water pumps was blamed for the overheating and explosion of the number 3 engine, it was suggested by some that their primary purpose wasn't for cooling, but rather for improved performance. However, it was hard to deny that it played no role in the incident. Nevertheless, the consequences of such an occurrence were averted thanks to one man, Captain Megadis, because he could have stuck to Boeing's checklist and kept the landing gear extended. Fortunately for everyone on board and below, he didn't. He simply chose to trust in his experience and was able to think ahead and break the rules in a way that saved the lives of almost 500 people and potentially even thousands more. The most impressive part is that he only had around 93 seconds to make this decision. Incredibly, the same flight crew still ended up flying the passengers to New York on a replacement 747 at 6 p.m. the same day. As for the affected 747, reports noted that it stayed with Olympic Airways until 1985 before joining Transworld Airlines. It was finally retired in 1997 after 24 years of service. Megadis was reportedly so proud of the feat that he kept a copy of the flight data recorder with him as proof for whenever people doubted his tremendous story. In a 1994 interview, Megadis stated, "Those of us who survived that day are stowaways in life." The story of Olympic Airways Flight 411 was a lesson about trusting one's gut in the midst of a dangerous situation. Though there was still a chance that the nearby hills would pose a threat, Captain Megadis disregarded the possibility and had faith in his abilities to maneuver the enormous aircraft among the crowded buildings. Ultimately, Megadis overcame every obstacle, and none could be more thankful for it than the other 417 passengers on Flight 411. How do you feel about the bravery of Captain Megadis? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below.